That's the wrong formula, the black waitress whispered to the billionaire, just before the $100 million deal. What if the most important business advice of your life came from someone you'd never expect? Margaret Williams had been serving coffee and pie at Murphy's Diner for 37 years, watching suits come and go with their briefcases and big talk. Her weathered hands knew every crack in those old ceramic mugs, and her sharp eyes had seen more broken dreams than anyone cared to count. She'd raised 3 children on waitress wages, put 2 through college, and never once complained about the ache in her feet after a 12-hour shift. But on this particular Tuesday morning, when the silver-haired man in the expensive coat spread those papers across table 6, something made her pause. The numbers didn't look right. Not at all. She'd seen enough tax forms helping her kids with their homework, enough bills and calculations to know when something was off. And this was very off. Where are you watching from tonight? The man's name was Richard Pemberton, though Margaret only learned that from the embossed business card he'd left on the sticky table. She'd seen his type before, men who ordered black coffee and barely touched the eggs, always checking their phones, always somewhere else in their minds. But Richard was different. He said please and thank you, asked about her grandchildren when he noticed their photos taped to the register, and always left a $20 tip on a $7 meal. For 3 weeks now, he'd claimed table 6 every Tuesday morning, spreading contracts and financial documents like a makeshift office. Murphy's Diner wasn't the kind of place where billionaires usually conducted business, but Richard had explained to Margaret that he did his best thinking away from the chaos of corporate towers. The familiar smell of bacon grease and coffee helped him focus, he said, reminded him of his grandfather's kitchen back in Ohio. Margaret had developed a soft spot for the man. Despite his wealth, and she could tell from his watch and shoes that he had plenty, he treated her like a person, not invisible help. When her arthritis flared up last week, he'd quietly switched to a table closer to the kitchen so she wouldn't have to walk so far. Small kindnesses like that meant everything to someone who spent her days being overlooked. But this morning felt different. The papers were different. Instead of his usual contracts, Richard had spread out what looked like a complex formula, pages of calculations that would determine something called a merger valuation. Margaret caught glimpses as she refilled his coffee, numbers that started with hundreds of millions. The biggest deal of his career, he'd mentioned to his assistant on the phone. As she wiped down the neighboring table, Margaret's trained eye caught something that made her stomach drop. The formula was wrong. Not just a little wrong, catastrophically wrong. The kind of mistake that would cost fortunes and destroy lives. She'd seen her son work through similar calculations during his accounting degree, had helped him check his homework more times than she could count. The decimal point was in the wrong place, and the compound interest calculation was backwards. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Should she say something? What if she was wrong? What if a waitress with a high school education was about to embarrass herself in front of one of the most powerful men in the city? Margaret watched Richard review the formula one final time before his 10 a.m. meeting. Her chest tightened with each passing minute. She double-checked the calculations during her smoke break, using the back of an old receipt and her reading glasses. There was no doubt, the formula would undervalue the merger by nearly $60 million. Someone was about to get cheated, badly. The bell above the door chimed as Richard's business associates began arriving. 3 men in identical navy suits, carrying leather briefcases and wearing expressions that meant serious money. Margaret recognized the lead man from the newspaper, Jonathan Hayes, CEO of Hayes Industries. The merger between Hayes Industries and Richard's company would create thousands of jobs, the article had said. Good jobs for working families like the ones in her neighborhood. Margaret, sweetheart, could we get some more coffee over here? Richard called out, his voice carrying that genuine warmth she'd grown fond of. The pet name didn't bother her the way it might from other customers. From Richard, it felt like family. As she approached with the pot, her hands shaking slightly, Margaret overheard Hayes speaking in low, urgent tones. The board is getting nervous, Richard. If this valuation is wrong, if we're overpaying. He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. Margaret had heard enough kitchen gossip over the years to know that business deals fell apart over much smaller mistakes than this. She thought about her grandson Marcus, fresh out of college and working at Hayes Industries as a junior analyst. His first real job, with benefits and a future. If this deal collapsed because of a formula error, hundreds of people like Marcus would lose their jobs. Not to mention what it would do to Richard, who'd treated her with more respect than most people in her own family. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. In 37 years of serving coffee and keeping quiet, she'd never interfered in a customer's business. But she'd also never watched someone about to walk off a cliff without saying a word. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. The decision had to be made now. The meeting was starting in 5 minutes. Margaret approached the table with coffee, her mind racing. Richard was pointing to the formula with confidence, explaining the calculations to Hayes and his associates. As you can see, gentlemen, based on these projected revenues and the compound growth formula, Hayes Industries is valued at approximately $40 million. Excuse me, Mr. Pemberton, Margaret interrupted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The table fell silent. 4 pairs of expensive eyes turned toward her, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I'm sorry to bother you, but... She took a shaky breath. That formula isn't right. Hayes's eyebrows shot up. I'm sorry, did the waitress just interrupt our merger discussion? His tone carried the kind of dismissive irritation that Margaret had endured her entire working life. But Richard held up his hand. Margaret has 3 kids she put through college and knows her way around numbers better than most people I know. What did you notice, sweetheart? Margaret's hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. The decimal point in the compound interest calculation, it's shifted. And the growth rate, you've got it calculating backwards. Instead of 40 million, Hayes Industries is worth closer to 100 million by my count. She pulled the receipt from her apron pocket, covered in her careful calculations. I checked it 3 times during my break. The silence stretched so long Margaret could hear the grill sizzling in the kitchen. Hayes's face had gone pale, and his associates were frantically pulling out calculators. Richard stared at the papers, then at Margaret, then back at the papers. Jesus, one of Hayes's men whispered after running the numbers. She's absolutely right. We were about to undervalue our company by $60 million. Hayes stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the linoleum floor. Richard, what kind of operation are you running here? How does a formula get this wrong? His voice carried the sharp edge of a man who'd nearly been cheated out of a fortune. Margaret felt the weight of the moment crushing down on her. She'd just potentially destroyed Richard's biggest deal by pointing out his mistake in front of his business partners. The man who'd shown her nothing but kindness for months, who'd asked about her grandchildren and tipped like money didn't matter. She might have just ruined his career. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Richard's face was unreadable as he studied the corrected formula, while Hayes paced behind his chair, whispering urgently to his associates about trust and competence. The tension in Murphy's diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard finally looked up from the papers, his expression serious but not angry. Margaret, he said quietly, thank you. You just saved this deal from becoming the biggest disaster of my career. Hayes stopped pacing and stared at Richard. Saved it. Your team made a $60 million error, and you're thanking the help. That's when Richard's demeanor shifted. The gentle businessman Margaret had come to know disappeared, replaced by the steel that had built his empire. He stood slowly, his voice carrying quiet authority. Jonathan, that woman's name is Margaret Williams. She's worked here for 37 years, raised 3 children, and just showed more integrity and competence than anyone on my financial team. She didn't have to say anything. She could have watched us make fools of ourselves and gone about her day. Instead, she risked embarrassing herself to save us from a catastrophic mistake. Margaret watched as Richard walked over to where she stood by the coffee station, her hands still shaking from the confrontation. Margaret, I need to ask you something important. That grandson of yours, Marcus, he works at Hayes Industries, doesn't he? She nodded, confused about where this was going. Did you know that if this deal had gone through with the wrong valuation, Hayes Industries would have been so undervalued that my board would have demanded layoffs to make up the difference? Your grandson's department would have been the first to go. Margaret's eyes widened. She hadn't known, hadn't even considered that angle. She'd just seen wrong numbers and felt compelled to speak up. Richard turned back to Hayes, who was listening with growing understanding. This woman didn't just save our deal, Jonathan. She saved it properly. With the correct valuation, both our companies benefit fairly. No one gets cheated, no one loses their job, and we can move forward with integrity. Hayes looked at Margaret with new eyes, then back at Richard. I owe you an apology, ma'am. And apparently, I owe you a debt of gratitude as well. If you've been enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales like this. But Richard wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. Janet? I need you to run a complete audit of our financial department. Today. 3 months later, Margaret Williams received an invitation that changed her life forever. The elegant cardstock requested her presence at the Hayes Pemberton Industries headquarters for the official merger celebration. But the real surprise came when she arrived and found her name on a reserved seat at the head table, right between Richard and Jonathan Hayes. During the ceremony, Richard stood to address the crowd of shareholders, employees, and media. This merger represents more than just two companies joining forces, he began, his eyes finding Margaret in the audience. It represents the power of speaking up when something isn't right, regardless of who you are or where you come from. Our deal was saved by someone who had every reason to stay quiet, but chose to do what was right instead. He gestured toward Margaret, who felt tears welling up as the room erupted in applause. Margaret Williams taught us that wisdom doesn't come from corner offices or expensive degrees. Sometimes it comes from someone who spent 37 years watching people, caring about their lives, and having the courage to speak truth to power. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Hayes stood and announced that Margaret's grandson Marcus had been promoted to senior financial analyst, heading up the new Integrity Oversight Department, a position created specifically because of what had happened that Tuesday morning at Murphy's Diner. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself alone with Richard on the building's observation deck, looking out over the city lights. You know, he said quietly, my grandfather used to tell me that the most important business advice would come from the last person I'd expect. I thought he was just being philosophical. Margaret smiled, thinking of her own grandchildren and the lessons she hoped to pass down. Sometimes the people serving your coffee see things the people in suits miss. We're just not usually brave enough to say so. Well, I'm grateful you found your brave that morning. Richard handed her an envelope, a consulting contract offering her a position as advisor to the company's new ethics board. What do you say? Ready to trade your apron for a business card? Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the night air like music. Can I keep working Tuesday mornings at Murphy's? Some things are too important to give up. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales about the extraordinary courage found in ordinary people. Thank you for joining us on Margaret's journey. May we all find the wisdom to speak up when it matters most.